Hi, folks. I'm John Kraska, Executive Director for EveryLibrary and the EveryLibrary Institute. Thank you for being part of this edition of EveryLibrary Live Ben Books Week 2024. I'm very excited to be able to have this conversation with two wonderful authors, Jo Knowles and Frederick Joseph. We're talking this week with a lot of different authors and a lot of publishing industry folks as well about a couple big ideas. Some of it's about book bans and censorship. It is Ben Books Week after all. But we also want to talk about the culture of reading in this country, the joy of writing, the opportunity to talk about libraries and how people access and read these days. And I mean, it's post-pandemic. It's a fraught time for America. It's important for us to be able to try and change the headline. We spend a lot of time here at Every Library working on issues around censorship. Our fight for the first platform is a significant front in the fight against censorship and discrimination. So many of these different censorship campaigns are really campaigns of erasure, and they're trying to eliminate the telling of stories from diverse populations. They're trying to criminalize books about people, and we're working on the ground with over 100 local communities and school districts to oppose censorship, to put those books back on the shelf, and have every reader be able to access their own story. I want to make sure that you folks know about this before we get started, and also to check out Every Library as this session progresses today, as this conversation progresses. We do a tremendous amount of work in the space of securing funding for public libraries and for school libraries and school library programs. And we want to have, like I said, a good conversation with the American public in the lead up to the election, after the election, about what libraries can and should be doing in communities and on campuses. I'm very excited today to bring in two wonderful people, Jo Knowles and Frederick Joseph, for a conversation about their work, their writing, and that culture of reading and libraries conversation. So let me do the formal intros, team, okay? So Frederick Joseph is a Yonkers, New York raised, two-time New York Times and USA Today best-selling author. His books include a poetry collection, We Are Alive, Beloved, two books of nonfiction, a collaboration called Better Than We Found It, and a children's book, The Courage of the Dream. We're going to be talking today about that work as well as his new work, The Black Friend. And his books have been named an Amazon Editor's Pick, notable by the International Literacy Association, a Booklist Editor's Choice, as well as longlisted for the Green Earth Book Awards. Very much looking forward to chatting with you about this work, Joseph. Jo Knowles, our other panelist, is the author of Still a Work in Progress, Read Between the Lines, and Lessons from a Dead Girl. Her newest book is See It Harry's. Some of her awards and recognition include being a New York Times Editor's Choice and Notable Book, the Penn New England Children's Book Discovery Award, the American Library Association's Notable List, and YALSA's Best Fiction for Young Adults. Jo, I'm going to talk to Frederick for a few minutes and then bring you back in. I definitely want to talk about what it means to be on YALSA's list like that. Jo, oh, sorry. Let me do tech support here for myself. Frederick, hi.
Hey, how are you?
Nice to have you with us today.
I'm feeling good. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So your book, I had to keep it from my son stealing it and taking it off to college with him. When it arrived, he's like, "Okay, I want in on this one." I'm glad that I have it with me today, and I'm glad I had a few minutes to spend some time looking at it before we were talking today. You're a writer who crosses multiple genres: poetry, nonfiction, children's literature. I want to talk about writing. I want to talk about reading. I want to talk about the joy of it all. How do you cross genres like that?
You know, I think that the root of my writing is poetry. And so I kind of like work from the inside out in that regard. Whether I'm writing for, children or teens or adults, I try to have a sense of lyricism and to capture the world through sentences that remind me of the poetry I grew up reading, remind me of the poetry I enjoy writing now. So I guess that's really it. And a lot of my background outside of writing is in political science, hence why I do write about some of the things I discuss. So I don't know. I don't know if that's a great answer, but I feel as though all of my interests, my backgrounds and passions, as well as my academic background kind of intersect perfectly to allow me to write across genres.
I'm reminded as you're saying that of one of my favorite movies growing up. I mean, I'm in my early middle ages now, mind you. And it was Dead Poets Society. And the
Oh,
Robin Williams character
yep.
says that the reason we read poetry is because we are human beings, because we are alive.
Yes, yes, it's one of my favorite movies. May Robin Williams rest in peace.
Mhm.
For me, poetry is our first romantic language, right?
Mhm.
We have novels and nonfiction, so on and so forth, but we don't honor enough of like poetry is at the root of everything that we say beautifully, whether you're saying it in an essay or you're saying it again in a novel or you're saying it in a short story. Like the root of that ability is poetry. And so I try to honor that, not just in actually having written a poetry collection recently, but just even in The Black Friend. Like there are moments in that book where one of my personal favorite lines is, when I'm talking about I want to be soul food. I want to be a mother dancing bachata with her child. I want to be jazz. I want to
Mhm.
be a mother placing a sari on her daughter. I want to be all these beautiful aspects of being a person of color. I think that the world needs to figure out how both whiteness and people of color can intersect and decide like these things are beautiful and how do we honor that, right? So, it's one thing to just say like being a person of color is good, but when you can really like honor it in the language of the beautiful aspects of being a person of color, that's what I attempt to do in that book.
There's you read a review of a book like one of yours, and they talk about it euphemistically as a conversation on race,
Yeah,
and it always bothers me. It bothers me that they're calling it a conversation because sometimes folks don't listen, folks don't want to talk.
yeah,
But what you're describing here is something that I think is absolutely important, which is the poetic nature of our human connections.
right.
The idea that there's so many barriers in literature and publishing today, in the way that libraries even shelve things. I mean, I think that you're doing a heck of a job obviating those barriers.
I appreciate it, and I think that that's exactly it. It's funny. I'm not a huge fan of the conversation kind of umbrella either. Always, I think that what I'm trying to do is hone in on the beauty of different human existences, right? Or even if there's poems or essays where I'm writing about my dog, and so I'm not really having a conversation about dogs. I'm writing about the beauty of being like a pet parent, right? And the beauty of just being in proximity to animals. So it's not, I understand why people look at the term conversation and use that quite often, but I think what we're doing is something even more beautiful and essential than that.
Well, there's a tremendous amount of hope in this book,
Mm,
and hope for connection, hope for change, hope for, um, I mean, being heard. I guess I
yeah,
could say that. I mean, you're writing for a younger audience. I mean, but adults read this book too. I hope.
constantly.
What impact are you looking to try and make?
Yeah, I think that understanding is for me um, the most important thing. And I think understanding is hope, right?
Mhm.
For us to take a second and see how even when we aren't on surface alike, we actually are, right? Like it's funny because I have a long tattoo here. It's a jazz piece, right? I'm a huge fan of jazz. And one day this young white guy was passing me, said, "Hey, can I ask about your tattoo?" And we just got to talking about the stories of tattoos. He had no idea about jazz whatsoever. And he
Mhm.
comes from, I think he was from like Wyoming, but we talked about tattoos for 2 hours randomly in a park, right?
Mhm.
Because the reason that was able to happen is we don't facilitate understanding. Now, I walked away from that conversation with, a better understanding of Wyoming and some of his tattoos, and he walked away from that conversation with a better understanding of a black guy from New York, and not just my tattoos, but jazz. He's like, "Oh, I'm gonna go find out who Miles Davis is." And again, I know that some people might look at that as conversation, but it's so much bigger than that because what we were able to capture in that moment was this understanding of who we are and how we can walk away from that with the hope of who we can be as a society. That one sort of conversation there and understanding like, hey, there's something here that we're just not tapping into as people, and that's trying to see what the similarities are, right?
You touch on really solid themes of masculinity, whether we're talking about the Black American experience or the white American experience or any American's experience. And poetry is one of those areas where guys, in quotes, have a hard time with. And jazz, though, is one of those intersection points, and the blues too,
Yeah.
where truly masculine stories happen in that poetic idiom. I mean, you're writing for something that I would assume is coming out of your personal experience. I mean, you have it inked on your body.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, for me, I grew up just really wanting to, I guess, again, understand the world around me, and music helped me do that,
Hmm.
especially jazz, as one of the premier and first Black American art forms that, gained notoriety.
Hmm.
Our Black music kind of gave root to every single form of music in this country that's popular, but the blues and jazz and soul were kind of the three musical forms that kind of set everything on fire, if you would. It was the way in which we honored our trauma, but honored the trajectory towards freedom and honored the trajectory towards progress. And, for me, when I think about how that also intersects with, my unpacking of masculinity and white supremacy and all these difficult topics, I'm like, we've always done that. Musically,
Hmm.
we've done that since forever, right? Like a guy, Muddy Waters or anyone else kind of singing like, my old lady left me, so on and so forth. That's him unpacking what it feels to be alone as a man, right? In the
Yeah.
same way that I want people to unpack what it feels like to be in these systems that are detrimental to, people who are marginalized. And so when I'm doing some of that work on myself as a cishet man, that's important to me also because I'm asking that white people do something that I'm not afraid to do myself, right? I
Hmm.
think that we all have privileges, powers within the various structures in which we exist. And if I can do it, then so can you, right? If I ask a white person to consider the experiences of a person of color, a Black or brown person, so on and so forth, that's nothing that I'm not willing to do about a woman, right? If I'm going
Hmm.
to think about, hey, what is it like to not be able to jog at night necessarily without feeling like you might be harmed by a man as a woman? That's the same way I'm asking you to think about what it's like to be a Black kid walking to a classroom and you have a white teacher, a white principal, and you might be one of the two Black kids in the entire class. What does
Hmm.
that feel like? And you're reading from textbooks that are geared towards teaching a history that is extremely white and sometimes extremely false. So again, we all have to kind of sit with what it looks like to consider people who are just not ourselves.
There's an advocacy role sometimes in writing. Sometimes you write just to tell a good story. I mean, can you describe a little bit about what was the impetus to write The Black Friend? I mean, you just unpacked a lot of different meta issues in
Yeah.
here, and yet you're trying to write for an audience. Do you put that audience in your mind first, or do you put the story in their mind first?
I think for me, it's interesting because writing a book of nonfiction versus writing, say a novel are so different. And it's funny, I have a novel coming out in May that is about book bans. It's a YA novel about a group of kids in a writing class tackling book bans. And so, but what I realized was I came from both the novel and the nonfiction the exact same place, trying to fill a gap. Right. That's exactly why I write. I won't put anything out that doesn't fill a gap. Even my picture book that ties into the Black Panther film series from Marvel Studios.
Hmm.
I invented a character and write about a little disabled Black girl because we don't have enough books about disabled children. Right.
Hmm.
So I'm constantly thinking if I'm going to do the work, what is the best work I can do based on what we don't currently have? So I think going into this book, The Black Friend, I just looked at the landscape of books and my own upbringing and said, you know what? If I was to write a book that just kind of chronicles some of the things that I've been through and brings in other thought leaders and things of that nature, would there be a chance that another Black or brown child won't have to go through some of the things that I went through? right? And does that book exist? And seeing that the book didn't exist yet, I said, okay, well, this is the book I'm writing. And so that's constantly it. If I'm writing about patriarchy, okay, well, who has written about patriarchy and what have they said? Because I don't need to reinvent the wheel. I can tell you, go read their book. The only way I'm going to write a book is if the book has not been written.
That's quite lovely. I dig that. Let me ask you to take a deep breath and sit off to one side for a minute while I bring in our colleague Jo Knowles here, okay?
Okay.
And I want to bring you back in to wrap up that conversation as well, Frederick. That's the book that hasn't been written. What a great launching point for me to ask Jo. Again, the author of See You at Harry's, among other wonderful works. Jo, was this the book that you had to write like that?
Yes, in fact, I just loved what Frederick was just saying. Yeah, this book is certainly, we all have the book of our heart, and I like to think all of our books are partly books of our hearts, but this book in particular was written to honor my brother, who died unexpectedly when I was a young mother. And actually working on a book. It was supposed to be my first humorous novel about growing up in the restaurant business and all the mischief that my brother and sister and I got into while my parents were busy running the business and we were getting into trouble. And when my brother died, I stopped working on the book because I thought it would just be too painful to write. But as I was recovering and figuring out a way back to being me again, I realized that one way to honor my brother would be to continue to write this story and maybe try to reinvent our childhood to be a little bit better for him. And so that's sort of where this book comes from. Of course. Yeah, go ahead.
That's beautiful. You've never been shy in your writing, though, about exploring complex emotional themes. Mm-hmm. Adolescence, for many people, is a traumatic time. The way that you're trying to root this in, I mean, memory and memoir are so curiously intertwined. I mean, sometimes your memories don't line up with other people's memories. You're not writing a memoir here. I'm not suggesting that, but like, how do you care for your readers in a place where it's so complex and there is real trauma there?
Yeah. I think the most important thing for me as a writer is to tell the truth. I respect that we all want to protect children. Mm-hmm. And so, but at the same time, I think arming them with knowledge of the truth that sometimes really hard things happen is the better way to protect them. And what better and safer way to read about some of the difficult things that might happen to you in life through literature first. I'm certainly that was the case for me as a child. So I acknowledge that my books are often dealing with difficult. I don't love that word, but difficult.
Yeah, difficult for you. Conversation for Frederick. Those are again.
Yeah.
What is it? What's the New York Times comfortable talking about?
Right. And it's not a surprise that my books have been getting banned, especially in the climate that we're in, and See You at Harry's in particular. Not necessarily even because of the thing that I think is the most difficult, which is a death, tragic death in this book, but because there's one character, an older brother who happens to be gay, and I find that tragic because we are, as you were talking about earlier, we're allowing, that's not the right word, but what is happening right now in many states is that we are erasing certain experiences. And when those books get removed from libraries and schools, public libraries and school libraries, this is the only access most kids have to books. They don't have the money to go into a bookstore and buy the books that they desire or download books. Libraries are the only access point they have. And so when those books get removed, access to those stories is gone. And, in some cases gone forever, because some of these books get banned and then they go out of print and there's no way of getting them back. And so that to me is the tragedy that we are experiencing right now.
Well, you said something a moment ago that I think is very poignant and rather brilliant, which is you have to trust the kids to read. And there's such a there was a report issued by the fellow who's the current governor of the state of Louisiana when he was running for governor. He was the attorney general of the state of Louisiana. He issued a report called "Protecting Innocence," in order to sideline. I mean, we always talk about literature as being a place of empathy, but I don't think enough people remember or recognize that literature is also a place of self-identification and normalization. And what you're describing here about, I mean, the big issues that kids are facing in real life. If this gets shut off because of somebody's concern that kids can't handle it, then kids are going to be in more trouble. I think.
I do too. And I don't think it is possible to protect children from the things that happen. Tragedies happen, car accidents happen. People have, cancer, or a parent who has a terminal illness or something. We all experience things that are out of our control. And so it's impossible to keep children innocent forever. And I think that's trying to do that is actually much more harmful than talking about things in a safe space that they might experience. And also, of course, empathy is another issue. Children read stories. Maybe they read stories about things that will never happen to them, but it might happen to one of their best friends. And so then if they have read one of these stories already, then they know maybe a little bit better of what another child is going through. So yeah, I just think it's the wrong way to approach what we're dealing with here. It is impossible to do what that was it a governor said. It's just not possible.
No, protecting innocence is not. So if I can also say though, this book is pretty funny at times. Like this isn't some like long slog through, like self-help. No, I mean,
No.
the restaurant allows for so many people to come in and out that door, both the front door and the back door. The staff, I mean, like the family relationships. This must have been fun to write it.
Oh yeah, it was fantastic. And I was able to get lots of family photos and memories from my family as I was gathering up, all this stuff that it takes to find the story in the first place. I knew the backdrop would be the restaurant, but just talking to my brother and sister about like, what's the funniest thing you remember? And the scene where Holden steals the ice cream truck. My brother actually did steal a truck to get to a roller skating contest.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Wait, your brother stole the truck, number one. Number two, to do what?
He loved roller skating, and he was in this competition, and he was only 15 at the time, so he didn't even have a license. And my dad was running at this time, the restaurant business was long gone, and he was now running this rental company. And so my brother took the keys to one of the U-Haul trucks of all things and drove to this competition. And so I just had to put that I had to figure out a way to put that. Yeah.
That's fantastic. I love it. Last quick question for you, Solo, and I'm going to bring Frederick back in. I mean, you've been on the YALSA Best Fiction for Young Adults list. I mean, YALSA is the Young Adult Library Services Association. It's part of the American Library Association. It's some of the best and brightest when it comes to youth services librarianship. It must have been an honor to be recognized on that list. But I mean, are you finding that the conversation in libraries and in bookstores right now with youth is as honest as you want it to be?
Oh boy. Well, first of all, yeah, a huge honor, but also it just meant that my books became accessible to so many more kids than they ever would have. As and not a well-known author, that suddenly it introduced me to many more librarians than ever would have. So that was a wonderful opportunity. And the times that I've been able to do school visits and speak with teenagers, they're not changing. Their needs aren't changing. The things they want to talk about aren't changing. It's the gatekeepers that are changing that. And so I've had fewer opportunities to have school visits because of so many of my books being on these lists. And I've been very outspoken about it. So that doesn't probably help me, but it's too important for me not to be. So I've had less interaction than I would love. but the moments that I do get to talk to teenagers, it's always the same. And almost every single time there are kids in the audience who either are brave enough to raise their hand during the presentation Q&A, or who come up after me after my presentation to say, thank you for writing stories about kids like me. And that's the key, right?
Yeah, that's fantastic. And let me bring in Frederick again, because I see you nodding, Frederick, off camera there as Joe's talking. I'm very interested in, I mean, the two of you, and I got to introduce you today, which is really kind of a thrill for me professionally and personally. If I could just do what were you listening to while each other talked? I mean, I've got 27 questions for you about empathy and about race and gender and trauma and joy. But I mean, tell me a little bit about each other.
Can I go first, or?
Yeah, sure.
So it's interesting. One of the things I love that Joe was talking about was just honoring the humanity of young people, right? Not hiding young people from the realities of the world because they're experiencing them, right? That's so important. And whether we're talking about, and that's another reason why books are banned, because adults want to lie to young people, sadly, at times, right? We want to pretend that we weren't young ones. I remember being 12 and 13 and 14, and I write from a place of remembering what I was doing and what I was experiencing at that time. And I just think we need more courageous authors like Joe to continue that work and saying those things and really speaking truth to power in that way.
That's a beautiful statement there, Frederick. And the idea of a courageous author. I mean, I want to rabbit hole you for one more second. I know you've done some work on DEI initiatives with corporations. I mean, I'm not trying to blame the library industry. The whole world seems like it's given lip service at different points.
Yeah, it very much is. I, as a Black American with a public presence, I suppose, I was oftentimes brought in around 2020 after, the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, to have these conversations, right, with various institutions. And that lasted for about a year. And those institutions no longer not only bring me in, because it'd be fine if they were still bringing someone else in, but they're not bringing anyone in. And it's a sad reality, because I think it's not just an issue of race. It is also an issue of other identities, right? You talk about the LGBTQ plus community. You're talking about people with disabilities. You're talking about women. You're talking about all these different issues. And it's a shame, truly, because right now, what we're dealing with in November, we should have been at the forefront of this continuously leading up to this moment. And now everyone's kind of like running around like chickens with their head cut off, trying to figure out how do we have the conversations when, people like Joe, people like myself, people like, publishers like Candlewick Press have been honoring and having those conversations for decades. And so, we should continue to work, as opposed to when everything's on fire, try to get a bottle of water.
Yeah, I get you. Joe, what are your thoughts? What are you thinking about today?
I was listening intently about the idea of conversation and what that means. And again, Frederick is just talking about it now, and thinking about conversation as connection, and opportunities to connect. And those are the things that are so essential for us to move forward. I feel like we are denying ourselves that connection. When you have that connection, it's like seeing each other's humanity. When you have those conversations, those park conversations about a tattoo, but they also allow you to make the next step in that. But if we are denied having those connections in the first place and not having those conversations, we can't see the humanity of each other in the way that we need to in order to move forward and have more sensitivity to what all walks of life are going through right now. People are suffering in all different kinds of ways for all different kinds of reasons. And it just seems like there's this really deliberate attempt to keep people in the dark, and banning books is one way to do that. And we think knowledge is power, right? The more we know about each other, the more we know we're not the only ones in a certain situation. That empowers us. And I feel like this movement, this book banning movement, it's more about disempowering youth, but disempowering all kinds of communities. And so that's sort of where I'm at right now. I feel like the book banning thing is just a ruse to do this other much bigger thing, which is power.
Oh, Jo, you're absolutely right. I'm going to put up our book banning petition here at Every Library. So folks, when they their heart's burning within them while you're talking here, Jo, I want them to do something about it. You're absolutely correct. We've worked on hundreds of these situations, some of them in one zip code or one school district. We've got statewide partners like the Florida Freedom to Read, the Texas Freedom to Read, the Alabama Read Freely groups that we're supporting. So many of these book bans are wolf in sheep's clothing. They're going after the institutional libraries. They're going after education, the structure of education. They're going after the public sector workforce. But the other part of it is just how many of these attacks are not even about the First Amendment. They're about the 14th. They're about civil rights as much as that they are about civil liberties. And I've said this a couple times this week as we've been doing these sessions. It's about civil society too. What kind of neighbors? How do we want to treat our neighbors? How do we want to be treated ourselves? It's writ large in these challenges. The books that you both write are very. I don't want to use the word psychoactive because it sounds like we're tripping if we're reading, but the empathy intersection, the inspiration intersection, the honesty intersections here, you've done something that is puts a target on your backs for those kinds of book ban attempts, because you are doing something that leavens the conversation in America and it helps people see themselves. I mean, I'm grateful to you both for that.
Thanks.
Yeah. Now, I do want to ask you one more writer's process question, two more writer's process questions, and then we got to wrap up today, if that's okay. Let me ask you the traditional but very important for the young writer starting out. Okay, for the young writer starting out question, and it's interesting to me because I've never written fiction. I've done 2 textbooks for libraries, about how to run ballot measures, but I mean that was a process. What's your advice, Jo? If you don't mind going first.
Oh, okay. Read everything and try to write like your favorite authors. Practicing different voices and trying to find your own voice. It's all connected, but I think the most inspired I've ever been is when I'm reading myself, reading other stories and making those connections, and then realizing I have my own story to tell that's different. And maybe just as important. And I'm sure all young writers have the same importance. They all have a story to tell.
I love it. Frederick?
Well, I feel like that is the answer. Reading is the absolute answer. You have to practice, right? And I would also say play around with not just voice, but medium also, If there's a line and you feel like the line is not as strong, then maybe you want to try the line, expanding it through a poem and just come back to it. Like, does it feel different when I put that concept in a different, written form? The last thing I'll say is I'm really big on cinematic reads. And so I watch a lot of movies, right? Like I think scenes are super important, and dialogue is one of the most important things that you can capture in writing. And so when I'm stuck on something, I'll go watch an Oscar nominated film and just hone in on specific scenes and say, how can I do this again, but on the page, and really honor this conversation or this moment in a way that jumps out and captures people. So that's really big for me: reading, watching, and playing around with different forms.
That's real cool. Just Frederick, I'm going to put up your connect with you on here on the screen so people can follow along. You mentioned that you have another work coming out in May of 25 on book bans. Little teaser for that.
Yeah. So this is actually going to be my debut novel. While we're here, hopefully Candlewick will get Jo a copy of that. I'd love to hear her opinion. But yeah, it's my debut novel, and it centers a group of young writers in high school trying to use their literary talents to combat book bans that are going on, not just in their private school, but in their more broad community.
I'm going to invite you back to have another conversation about that one when it hits. And Jo, I want to invite you back too. Tell me what's on the horizon for you, if you could.
My next book is a middle grade novel. It will be illustrated by Glynis Fox, and it's called Someone's Gonna End Up Crying.
Oh, that's great.
I know. It's actually humorous, mostly, I think. It's about a girl named Maple, and she uses her artwork to help sort through her sibling relationships and school drama and her parents' increasingly fraught marriage.
Yeah. Well, I do want to invite you back, Jo, because we're trying to put together a series for of authors who've been disinvited from school visits. We want to do kind of the school visit of the air, and make sure that we can kind of, after hours, after school's out, do something like this where we'd be doing the school visits, through every library. So. All right, team, this has been a wonderful conversation today. I've enjoyed myself thoroughly. I hope everyone who's been watching has as well. Again, censorship team, all the issues with book bans, and this big conversation about the joy of writing and the culture of reading. I'm glad we could have it today. I want to invite everybody who's been watching to donate to EveryLibrary. We're your hosts. I'm doing my best Seth Meyers today. I hope I come off okay. In my day job, it's political action for libraries. We try and help libraries succeed at getting new funding and the authority to act. We also do a lot of block and tackle against bad bills in these campaigns that are happening on the ground. EveryLibrary.org/2024 is your opportunity to put a couple of dollars behind that if you believe in it too. Jo, Frederick, thanks again for today. What a treat.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.